take your Bibles with me this morning and turn in them to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. That's on page 983 if you're using one of the pew Bibles. And would you stand with me for this morning's reading? For this morning's reading, I'm going to be reading verses 9 through 12 from chapter 1. Verses 9 through 12 from chapter 1. Please follow with me as I read. And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. May you be strengthened with all power, according to His glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. May the Lord add His blessing to the reading of His word. You can be seated. Some of our students like to keep track of certain words that will be frequented in the sermon. And if you're keeping track this morning, the words that will be prominent in the sermon this morning are rest and flesh. Rest and flesh. I want to start out by showing you a picture this morning. This is Mr. Rogers, many of you might recognize, and what you see in front of him is a fish tank, and he's feeding the fish. Now, I just read recently that he introduced this to the show to teach the children watching what responsibility looks like in caring for a pet. And at a certain point in the show, it became, he would feed it each day. And at a certain point, it got to the point where he would not say what he was doing in order to teach young children that responsibility just becomes inbuilt, that it becomes a habit, that you do good things naturally as you start facilitating these habits of responsibility. And he received a letter in the mail from a 5-year-old girl named Katie. And she said in the letter, and she requested that he say when he's feeding the fish, because she couldn't see him feed the fish, and it made her really worried about the fish. And then in parentheses, her father added, Katie's blind. And so she cries when you don't mention it, And so, of course, Mr. Rogers started saying, I'm feeding the fish now for 5-year-old Katie. And the reason I say that and tell you that is because I think there's a sense in which we can be very much like Katie in regard to the work of God in our lives. That we don't necessarily see God's strength taking care of us on a daily basis. And as a result of that, it's very easy when we don't think about God's strength being there for us to tap into, that we start very incrementally living according to our strength instead of according to His nurturing strength that's there, not just every day, but every moment. Like the song we just sang, I need you every single moment. And this is where Paul's particular, the part that we're going to focus on particularly today, in his prayer, really puts God's work in our lives that can be behind the scenes, but he wants to be front and center. Particularly the portion, the two clauses of Paul's prayer that we're going to be focusing on is in verse 11. May you be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might. Throughout your day, are you overwhelmed with God's power, with thoughts of God's power, with thoughts of God's glorious might, or are you overwhelmed with your weakness and your shortcomings and your inability to do what's placed before you? See, Paul wants you to be overwhelmed with God's power, with his might. He wants you to focus there. I believe it was Pastor Jason Meyer that said, stop telling God how big your problems are and start telling your problems how big your God is. And this is the type Pauline thinking that he wants to be coursing through our veins. He wants us to be considering his strength, his power, his might. And so, I show you this picture to say that we can be like Katie, unaware of what God is up to. But Paul's prayer is that we're aware of that power, that strength, and that might. I want to give you a brief outline of what we're going to do this morning, the track that we're going to follow. First, we're going to start with a brief refresher. It's been 2 weeks since we've been in the letter to the Colossians, and so I want to start and open with a refresher of where Paul's at in the letter. And then second, we're going to talk about rest's fruit. If God is the strong one in our life, what is left for us to do? If God's power is to be coursing through our veins, what is left for us to do except rest in that strength, rest in that power? Does that make sense? And as we do that, that power will produce fruit, God's power. And then we're going to look at how easy it is to not rest in God's strength. And so we're going to close with talking about unrest's flesh. Unrest's flesh. Let's start with a refresher of where we've been. So this is what's going on in the letter of Colossians. Has Paul ever met the Colossians? Yes or no? No, he's never met them. This church was started, we'll learn in just a bit, by a man named Epaphras, who likely heard Paul preaching in Ephesus, which is close by. It's far enough that it's a journey, but it's still within journey's distance. And he heard Paul preach, very likely there, became a believer himself, came back to his town in Colossae or Laodicea, they're near each other, and he shared the gospel with the people he knew. And as a result of that, a church began to form known as the Colossian believers. This is who Paul is writing. So Paul's never met them. Epaphras then goes to visit Paul to report that he's planted a church and there's some problems potentially brewing in this church. They haven't gotten bad yet, but they're on the rise. Epaphras can see it. So he wants Paul to write this letter to the Colossae believers so they can hear directly from Paul. So Paul is writing to them having never met them. But what he's doing is he's starting out his letter with a prayer. And essentially his prayer looks like this. Catch this. Colossae believers, what happened with Epaphras is my prayer that would happen with you. That just as Epaphras was like a plant grown by God and bore fruit, so my prayer for you is that you would be like Epaphras. You would be a plant that goes and blossoms and bears fruit. That's the idea. As Epaphras came to faith and then spread that faith to you, so I'm praying that as you've come to faith, so you spread that faith throughout the world, in your area. So it's just a continual multiplication of life taking place here, according to the strength of God. That's the long and short of what's happening in this prayer for the Colossae believers. So, let me just kind of put it to you this way. He wants them to walk worthy of the Lord. What does walking worthy of the Lord look like? And the answer to that is let me just put it to you personally. How do you know if you're walking worthy of the Lord right this very moment? It's a good question to ask yourself. Am I walking worthy of the Lord? According to Paul, walking worthy of the Lord equals bearing fruit. We're in the midst of the season of harvest for us, right? You see it all around. You're starting to see combines roll, and sometimes at night you see their lights on. And we were coming back on the highway last night, and we saw in the night combine going and corn just rifling into the store car, or whatever that's called. And so this is the season we're in. And here's how we can look at it. The corn's fruitfulness is in proportion to the sun. Correct? Like, I know there's other elements like the soil and water and rain and stuff like that. But the corn's fruitfulness, or the soybean's fruitfulness, is in proportion directly to the sun. If the sun isn't there, they don't grow. When the sun is there, they should grow. And this is what it's like to be walking worthy of the Lord. The corn is walking worthy of the sun if it bears fruit. If it doesn't bear fruit and the sun is out, the corn's got a problem. It should bear fruit in proportion to the sun's existence. And this is how Paul looks at walking with God. If you're walking with God, you will bear fruit, because He is the one that brings about fruit. Let me show you a painting here. This is by Thomas Cole. It's called The Course of the Empire, Destruction. This is depicting the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, one of the things that contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire is what Michael McCormick, a Harvard historian, calls the worst year to have ever been alive. Okay, now of course that's subjective and debatable, but he calls it the worst year to ever be alive. This comes from science.org, an article written by Ann Gibbons. And that year, that was, according to McCormick, the worst year to have ever lived is, there's the flood year. Like, that would have been a bad year, right? So, of course, this is somewhat subjective here. But Harvard historian says the year 536 AD. 536 AD. What happened in 536 AD? A volcanic eruption in Iceland spewed ash in the air, causing temperatures to drop. But most significantly, it caused the sun's light to be dimmed to that of like you were looking at the moon for 18 months. So as a result of that, the crops began to all but disappear, causing mass starvation throughout Europe. 536 to 546 is the coldest decade on record in 2,000 years. Crops failed in a variety of places: Ireland, Scandinavia, Mesopotamia, and China. And then, in 541 to 543, what's called the Justinian bubonic plague began spreading throughout the Mediterranean, killing, percentage-wise, 35 to 55% of the population. So, how did all of this start? With the absence of the sun. Kicked off what was one unbelievably horrific decade. Because where the sun is absent, chaos and death and destruction will result. And that's how Paul thinks about God. When you're with God, life happens. Think of Psalm chapter 1. Those who meditate on the law are like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season and whose leaves do not wither. So where God is, there is life, there is fruitfulness. And this is what Paul sees in Epaphras, who started this church in Colossae by the grace and strength of God. And now he's praying that for the Colossae believers, that they would live lives bearing fruit because they're walking with the Lord, who is like the sun. Now, the question is how do we go about bearing fruit? And this is where we want to talk about exactly how that happens. And we're going to talk about it this week, and we're going to talk about it next week as well. But the part I really want to focus on, as I mentioned at the beginning, is this is how bearing fruit happens. Just like the plant in your garden is contingent on elements outside of itself, like soil, rain, and the sun, so we and our fruitfulness, like plants, are contingent on the strength, the power, and the might of God. That you may be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might. You could think of John 15, where Jesus says, I am the vine, and you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And the vine dresser comes and he prunes the vine, prunes the branches, so that they suck more life from the vine itself. Depend more wholly on the vine in their agony. This is the idea. So, we just got to catch that when pain comes into our life, it's very easy to think that pain inserted itself apart from God, rather than God actually inflicted the pain. He's doing this. He's up to something as the vine dresser so that we will produce what? More fruit. This is what God is up to. I want to parade before your eyes a series of pictures. And I want you, as the series of pictures kind of goes before you, I don't want you to scream anything out, Gary Gustafson. I want you just to observe, just to take in, but as you see them, I want you to say to yourself, I want you to ask yourself, what is the thread that ties each of these things together? What is the thread that ties each of these things together? Okay, so what is the thread? Shout it out. All right, very good. Energy. Energy. Fuel. This is something that the world, and I could have gone on and on and on. I had a list, but I'm like, okay, they got to get the point, right, at this point. But we could have gone on and on. And this tells you that mankind recognizes something about himself, herself. What is it? That we need energy to do all that which we hope to do and accomplish. Whether that's our bodies or the tools we use or the energy that we get from the natural resources of the earth. This is something we pursue. This is what we're up to. We need energy to make things happen. And what's really easy to mess up is that all the while, God is offering himself as our most pivotal, most instrumental energy of all that we look around. That before we look at any of these things or tend to rely on any of these things, he's calling us to look to him. He wants the congregants to know that God is after us leaning into Him like we lean into all of these resources. In fact, the Bible will be very straightforward and say, if you produce something apart from His strength, it won't please Him. That unless the fruit that you produce is God-wrought fruit, it's just like chaff that the wind blows away. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. He's not saying, the Bible doesn't say you don't produce fruit that God didn't produce. We can produce fruit. Sin multiplies like crazy. In our family, in our culture, in our nation, in our world, sin just radically multiplies. So fruit can be born from sin, but it will be like chaff that the wind drives away. It will be here today and gone tomorrow. It's not substantive. So the only fruit which can please God is the fruit alone that's produced by God. This is a huge point in the Bible. How Paul is praying right now is backed up by the entirety of the Old Testament. That he wants his people, he wants the Colossae believers to understand that they are not to produce fruit in and of themselves. That only looks like the Pharisees traveling to the ends of the earth to make twice the sons of hell as they are. That's what our fruit looks like. He wants us to be fueled by God's strength. And this is where this concept of rest comes into the Bible. That God is not calling us to work apart from Him. He's calling us to rely on His work. This is the idea. Just consider a barrage of thoughts about rest as I throw them at you. We get the universe itself while man is resting, so to speak, in the dust. In the book of Genesis. Adam gets Eve when he's asleep. Abraham gets covenant confirmed when he's asleep. Jacob gets covenant confirmed when he's asleep. Joseph receives his dreams and future promises when he's asleep. So when you finish the book of Genesis, you're meant to say, God does His best work when His people are resting, sleeping, so to speak. We've known that in day 7, in the creation narrative, it's the only day that's blessed. It's the only day called holy. It's the only day with no ending formula. It's the first full day that Adam and Eve lived, intending that they're to live every other day in day 7. Then God gives Israel feasts, and those feasts continually point to rest, or 7, which is the day that's accompanied with rest. There were 7 festivals in an Israelite year. There were 7 commanded days in those festivals where rest was commanded. The month that had the most feasts in it is the 7th month. Each feast was intimately connected somehow to the number 7. Beyond the feasts, there's the 7th year where is to be no work. You're to completely rest. He'll give you enough food on the 6th to last you into the 8th. Then beyond that, when you put 7 years of 7 times, 7 years, 7 times, the following year of those 7 sevens is the year of Jubilee, in which all Israel was to receive their land back. So all of these things in Israel's calendar year are meant to whisper and shout God's program that they are to live according to God's strength. They are to rest in God's strength. And that would lead to fruitfulness. They would conquer the unconquerable as a result of living in God's rest. And so the first city that God has them confront when they get into the promised land is the city of Jericho. And in that conquering, this is how you be fruitful as you go into the promised land. They're to march around Jericho 7 days with 7 priests holding 7 trumpets. And on the 7th day, they were to march around the town, the city, 7 times. Do you see how God is just smacking them in the face with rest? Rest. Rest in me. You will be fruitful in your rest. When Joshua is about to die and hand over his blessing to the next generation, he says, look at how we won these battles. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. This is the idea that we are to every moment of every day say, God, what does your strength want out of me now? I'm your vessel in which your energy is mightily at work. How do you want me to handle this now? Just talked to a brother in Christ. He said, man, this week, he goes, I got to the place where I just almost walked out into the cornfield, just left it all. It was just one thing after another, one thing after another, one thing after another. What do we do in those moments? This is a little bit of my day yesterday. I just felt overwhelmed with everything that had to get done. And it was like, okay, well, I can make this measurement right now. I can do that. And it was just, what will God help me do in just inch fashion through the day? That's how we're to live, just relying on his strength and never getting exasperated, over anything, because what he demands, he supplies. What he calls us to, he equips us for. So every time you lose your cool in the midst of stress, you're not tapping into that which he meant for you to tap into, because it's there. Day 7 never ended. So you can live in this state of rest. But what we find as a sad history throughout the scriptures is that every time, mark that, every time God established rest for his people, they blew it with their strength. Every time he establishes rest for his people, they mess it up with their best efforts or their best thoughts. Okay? Now, what's really interesting throughout the Bible is that you'll find this pattern, and you need to make sure I tell you each part with each bullet point that's about to show up on the screen. Every time God establishes some form of rest, his people blow it with their thoughts or efforts, and then flesh is exposed in some way. Okay? Because this is really important that you get this, because the opposite of rest is flesh. Okay? The opposite of rest is flesh. Okay? So you need to catch this. You need to catch this, because before you experience the might and power of God, you need to understand like what a hankering you have for your flesh to get involved, for your work and your effort to eclipse God's strength, to bypass God's strength. Okay? You need to know that about yourselves, because it's true about you, just like it's true about me. All right? So let's just take a quick look through the Old Testament. So God establishes rest in Eden. Adam and Eve think they can put, a little nice touch on that, and they eat from the fruit, and as a result of that, what's exposed? Their flesh, their nakedness, okay? Noah, God establishes rest. Noah's name actually means rest. He gets rid of all the bad people on the earth, and he establishes rest. He's starting over. And Noah tries to establish rest his own way. He goes to sleep in his tent. But is that all he did? No. He decided to plant a vineyard, and just like Adam and Eve ate fruit, Noah imbibes fruit in wine, and he gets drunk, and what happens in his tent is he kind of rolls around. His flesh is exposed. All right, so it's like the second fall. All right, God establishes rest. Noah goes to sleep in his own way, and his flesh is exposed. Okay, so then you've got Abram's rest. God calls Abram out of Haran. He takes him safely to the promised land. He establishes him there. He confirms covenant with him there in chapter 15 of Genesis. And right after God does that, Abraham and Sarah look to secure God's promise of a son their way with Hagar, and Abram sleeps with Hagar. What happens when you sleep? You expose your flesh, okay? You got Jacob's rest. God promised Jacob that he was going, or promises his mom, Rebekah, that Jacob will be served by the older. The younger will be served by the older. Jacob has rest. He's got a promise secured for him by God. But instead, Jacob tries to get that blessing his way. And where does his flesh show up? Where does weird flesh show up with Jacob? Well, he puts on hairy skins, right? So he's like a beast chasing the promise, right? On his own terms. Okay? So then you got Israel's rest. God liberates them from Egypt. He brings them to Mount Sinai. He's established rest. They've got rest from their enemies. He takes them to Sinai. How is their flesh exposed at Sinai? Well, they take off all their glory to make a golden calf, and then it says they rose up to eat and drink and play. And when you see play in the Bible, that's what the king saw Isaac doing with Rebekah when he said that she's my sister. They were playing together, okay? So when they rise up to play, it's a sexual euphemism. So very likely Israel was having some sort of orgiastic thing going on around the golden calf. They lose their glory after God established rest, and their flesh is exposed. Tabernacle rest. So God continues with this people, and he establishes a tabernacle. It gets all set up. The fire of the glory of the Lord comes out from the tabernacle and lights the altar. God is in this place. It's awesome. It all's looking great in Leviticus 9. And then Leviticus 10 happens right after the tabernacle gets set up, right after rest is established. Nadab and Abihu take in some fruit. They're drinking wine, and they offer their strange fire, and their flesh is consumed by fire, and then their bodies are carried outside the camp where unclean flesh goes. Okay? So God establishes his house. There's a place of rest. Nadab and Abihu have their flesh exposed. David, it says that God established rest on every side. Right after that happens, David says, hey man, rest is good. You know, we're going out to fight battles, but they're just sort of maintaining battles. They're not, we need more. They're just maintaining. So I'm going to stay home. And he sees Bathsheba, and his flesh is exposed with Bathsheba, and the whole kingdom takes a nosedive. Solomon's rest. God establishes his temple through Solomon. Everything is looking great. They got rest on all sides. Silver is like the pebbles on the street. It's so common. Gold is just plentiful. Everything's incredible with Solomon. Then he multiplies wives, which is the exposure of his flesh, and the kingdom divides. Then, even in the divided kingdom, God establishes rest. He's making a way for this kingdom to become united again, possibly. And if they follow God, that they'll last in perpetuity. But as a result of them worshiping idols, Isaiah says, all of your gold jewelry will be taken off, and your baldness, your skimpiness of clothes, your belts will turn to ropes. In other words, you'll be marched off in slavery with your flesh exposed. So guys, here is the track of God's history. We had a pastor's table discussion with 20 or 30 pastors from the Quad City area. We went out to lunch afterwards, and a good friend was going through a tough thing, and he said, man, it's almost over. It's almost over. There's been some issues in the church, and I think we're at the close of this trouble that we've been enduring for some time. And I said to him, hey, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer of the group here, but that's the time you really need to worry. Because if you look at Israel's history, the moment the king was able to go, oh, finally, it all went to hell. Literally. That's what happens. I remember going through tough times and going in to talk to my dad and be like, this is going on and this is going on. He goes, Ben, that's for you. That's for you. The pain is for you. It's good for you to keep your nose clean. So we want pain to go. But the moment it goes in Israel's history, the moment nonstop dependence on the Lord has a chance to stop, all hell breaks loose. So rest is often facilitated by pain. Our prayer lives flourish in the midst of agony. They plummet in the midst of victory. That's the sad history of Israel. So when God looks at this, and he sees the future as well as he does the past, when he looks at this stuff, he says, hey, I got a great idea. Great idea. I am going to give them an object lesson that will teach them to get rid of their flesh and start living according to my spirit, which facilitates rest, right? Because of his strength. So what he gives, this is his great idea of, hey, this is how I'm going to remind you on a continual basis to not live according to the flesh. He gives circumcision. And everyone's like, ooh, this is weird. We all feel like junior hires, and, it's different now. Awkward. Here's the deal. Genesis 15 is when God confirms covenant with Abram. Genesis 17 is when he says, you need to cut off the foreskin. You need to cut off your flesh. In your most intimate region, most intimate area, you need to remove the flesh. So that's Genesis 15, he confirms covenant. Genesis 17, he says you need to remove the flesh. What's in Genesis 16? That makes Genesis 17 make sense. The answer is Hagar. Hagar, after God establishes covenant, after he says, it's all yours, Abraham, I promise. He wasn't going to do the covenant ceremony, but Abraham said, please, give me something for sure that will, he's like Gideon, give me something that I'll know for sure that your promises are going to come true. He says, okay, I'll give you this covenant ritual. You ask for it. Chapter 16, right after Genesis 15 stops. Now, in historical time, it's 10 years later, but it goes right into it. Him and Sarah take Hagar and try to have a son according to the flesh instead of according to the spirit. So Paul will call Ishmael the son of the flesh and Isaac the son of the spirit. Okay? So he gives them this object lesson to forever, perpetually remind them, remove your flesh and live according to my strength. Live according to my rest, in my rest. Now, do you want to know the kicker of all kickers? This is going to blow your minds as how messed up we are. Do you know what the Apostle Paul had to spend a great percentage of his time in the New Testament dealing with? Okay, let me just read this to you. I put in my notes, you need to read this to them because I don't want to butcher it, okay? Just listen to this. Catch this. The very ordinance God gave Israel to teach about the need for the removal of the flesh actually became the work of the flesh which Paul had to condemn. Let me put it to you another way. The sign which came to indicate the flesh's removal became the sign by which the flesh appeared. This is so crazy. That the actual object lesson God gave Israel to say, don't live according to your strength. Cut off the flesh. Don't live according to your thoughts. Cut off the flesh. Remember Abraham and Hagar. That's what led to Israel's captivity in Egypt. That's what leads to the conflict overseas right now in the Middle East. All of that was as a result of one decision according to the flesh. One decision. So God gives this lesson, cut off the flesh. Don't live according to your own strength, your own thoughts, your own wisdom. Don't do it. And all Paul, or primarily what Paul has to argue in the New Testament is, circumcision was given you to teach you to not live according to the flesh. Not becoming the flesh that's your only entrance into salvation. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. But what this demonstrates is our incredible resistance to live by God's strength instead of our own. That's what this proves in spades. I want to show you a picture. You know what that picture is? That is a picture of one of our rocket ships going into outer space. Taken from outer space. Doesn't it look like a bottle rocket? Look how infinitesimally small that looks. And that's our greatest ingenuity. That's our greatest brightness. That's the best we've got. And if you look at it from God's perspective, it brings to light when God says, after they built Babel, what did it say? God had to go down to look at it. You're like, it's a sandcastle to God. Man's best work is a joke to God. This looks like my 4th of July, little rocket I set off over Lake Superior. It's nothing. It's nothing. And this is what our work looks like. So our best works can never remove the flesh, can never produce fruit, can never do anything good. Nothing good could come by Abraham's hand. This is why Paul will say, in him, who's him? Christ. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead, and you, who were dead in your trespasses, in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and the authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. You see, friends, you get these weird passages in the Bible where the angel of the Lord almost kills Moses because he didn't circumcise his son. And his wife, in a fury, circumcises his son, and as graphic as it is, throws the foreskin onto Abraham. And Abraham is spared from being killed. Why? Because God is killing the flesh, did I say Abraham? It's Moses. Moses is living according to the flesh. And I just want all of us to see this morning that before you can ever live according to God's power, according to his glorious might, you need to be aware of your tendency to never switch the current from your battery to his nuclear power plant of energy. You've got a AAA. He's got a nuclear power plant, a hydroelectric water flow. God wants us to see that our sad history is to think with our own thoughts, to act with our own strength, to manipulate with our own best efforts. That's who we are. But Christ came to absolutely annihilate that. And he did it at the cross. That's where our flesh, which is so tempted to live according to our strength, that's where it died. And so if you're in Christ this morning, and we are about to partake of the elements, you need to be reminded that that thing in you, that flesh drive in you, was conquered. It was killed so that you live according to his might and his strength, and you switch your current over to his energy. Amen? What I would like to do is I'm going to have the guys upstairs play a song for us, and the words will be on the screen. It's called "The Gospel is Rest." And I just heard it this week, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is such a helpful song to help us as we come to the communion table. So this song will play. I want you to listen to it and just think of your own heart. Let the Spirit search you. And then the musicians will come right after, and we'll sing before we head to the communion table.